Let me first of all thank the organizer, my friend Chantal, for inviting me here to share my thoughts on recent development in asymmetric federalism in India. So before I start, what I intend to do is to briefly lay out the framework within which I work, and so that you have an overarching idea about the idea and the turn in asymmetric federalism in recent times. So asymmetric federalism is about, granting of differential powers, autonomy, but also about relationship between the federation as well as the subnational governments. And in that sense, it is a multi-level interactive system, which also entails a set of, unsettled as well as unraveling process at the multi-level across the federal system. So in my recent work, for example, I distinguish varieties of asymmetric federalism in Northeast India, characterizing it as a homeland state autonomy model that the Nagaland as well as Mizoram case presents in terms of giving more expansive powers on land and resources, where Nagaland Legislative Assembly can make inapplicable any law made by the parliament, and on religious customary practice, so and so forth, which is in effect less expansive in the case of the 6 scheduled areas, which I call it as decentralized autonomy model, where although certain considerable powers are conceded on matters regulating social and customary laws, the power of these 6 scheduled areas, the autonomous district council on land, is limited because they only have the power to regulate on actual use, and they simply do not have the plenary power or the legislative power to effect change in ownership of land. And I have also outlined the third model, which is the devolutionary autonomy model, which in effect can be explained in the case of the hill areas of Manipur and in some of the tribal pockets in the plain areas of Assam, where there is sub-state, constitutional symmetry, which cater to the administrative as well as developmental needs of territorially concentrated tribal groups. So having laid out this, what I intend to do is to lay out the recent development, which in effect I call it the symmetrical turn in India's federalism, which in effect happens not only at the federal level, but also resonate at the sub-state level. And you can see this in terms of the symmetrical turn in Jammu and Kashmir in recent times, but you can also see this in Nagaland in around 2012-2013. You can also see these resonate very well at the sub-state level in Manipur hill areas. So the most aggressive push to this symmetrical project, or what we call integrationist project, is represented by the recent revocation of Jammu and Kashmir special status by issuing 2 constitutional orders, Constitutional Order 272 and 273, which effectively make applicable all laws, all provisions of the Indian Constitution to the state of Jammu and Kashmir. And analysis on asymmetric federalism, for example, would entirely focus on the aggressive or integrationist role of the BJP. But I would, in effect, try to nuance this by arguing that although the BJP is very responsible in this aggressive and definitive symmetrical turn in India's asymmetric federalism, the Congress and other political actors are also implicated in laying institutional pathways for this institutional change over time. Evidence which became evident in development in Nagaland state around 2012-2013, where the Congress-led government, the Congress-led UPA government, in effect recanted its earlier position of accepting the constitutionality of Nagaland's Legislative Assembly resolution to claim exclusive sovereignty rights over land and resources, by arguing that given that natural gas and petroleum are the occupied field of the Union Parliament, the state of Nagaland, notwithstanding the fact that it has constitutional asymmetry under Article 371A, would not be entitled to regulate or frame its own rules on regulating land and resources. And the third case is a BJP-led government in Manipur, which, in effect, because of this integrationist impulse and centralization as well as majoritarian trust, would, in effect, try to neutralize long-standing constitutional asymmetry at the sub-state level by diluting the composition or constitution of the Hill Areas Committee, which, in effect, has its precedent in the erstwhile Assam state, where the Hill communities were given substantial power to regulate the terms of relationship between these territorial communities with the state governments by allowing them filter mechanism in ways which give them the plenary powers to regulate the terms of the social and customary practice, so and so forth. So in order to make sense, I use the analytical framework of actor-centered institutionalism to understand this asymmetrical turn in India's asymmetric federalism, both at the federal as well as at the subnational level. And as we all know, that within this framework, there is this argument that institutions are sticky because they are underpin complex power relationship, and this stickiness of political institution might be changed by the emergence of opportunity structure or certain critical junctures or tipping point, or as it were, path dependency, right? And these are affected when you have a complex alignment of the agenda, interests, as well as the ideas of actors, multiple actors at multiple levels across the polity. So I would nuance this by arguing the equally important role that intermediate agencies like context, political context and structures of institution play in affecting this change. So if you look at closely the literature, you'll find that there is a grain of literature which argues that asymmetric federalism is not central to India's national imaginary, and by that extension or implication to the management of conflict, which I argue otherwise, because had it not been for constitutional asymmetric federalism, given that in the crisis situation in 1947, the partition crisis, the massive communal violence, the integration of princely states, and subsequently the reorganization of linguistic provinces in the 1950s, 60s, which continued till the 1970s, and recently ended with the formation of Telangana in 2014, for example, would leverage the overarching imperative of securing administrative as well as political expediency, right? So although this administrative as well as political expediency came into play, given that you have enormous linguistic, religious as well as political histories which are distinctive, asymmetric or crafting asymmetric institutions become inevitable and unavoidable. So you'll see this in terms of the if you are to situate within the crisis literature, we'll consider, for example, that 1947 itself is an important critical juncture in crafting asymmetric institutions, and those are the time where you have competing debates between what I call the integrationists as well as accommodationists, the debates of which are resonating very well in the Constituent Assembly debates. And prior to that, in the Linguistic Commission report headed by Mr. Dhar, and which in effect come to this sense that given that we have partition at hand, India has now become a majority Hindu state, and therefore some of the symbolic superstructure of the state should represent the majority identity or cultural markers, as it were, the use of the cessation of Sudarshan as the label of Indian national flag, or the attempt to impose Hindi as the national language, so and so forth, mark this initial turn as well as initial pathways, which subsequently are caught up because of the complex alignment of interests, ideas, as well as agenda of multiple actors in the 1950s. Remember that the Zansang and most recently in the reorganization of Jammu and Kashmir recently, you have the Shiv Sena, the TRS, the YSRP, or other regional political, SAD Shiromani Akali Dal, for example, supporting very, very aggressively for the revocation of Article 370. So you have this moment of crisis which lay down institutional pathway of change, which in a sense also lays down the lineaments or the genealogy of this aggressive integrationist push which remained sidelined for quite a considerable period of time in the 1950s and 60s, which in effect got changed as a result of the changed political opportunity structure that came about as a result of the consolidation of the BJP both at the state as well as the federal level in 2014 and 2019. So you can make a sense in which these critical juncture or path-dependent change in political opportunity structure also affect or lays down favorable conditions for institutional change. And I think this is precisely where it is important that we should also factor in, as Professor Harihar pointed out, the co-relationship between asymmetric federalism and democracy. And to the extent that since the very founding of India's Federal Republic, there is a thin commitment, I would argue, not a thick commitment to democracy as well as to the principle of democratic justice. There are enough spaces of interaction between as well as within political actors which in effect germinate the basis or foundation of this aggressive integrationist push, which eventually culminated in the symmetrical turn. And this could be seen, for example, in some of the constitutional judgment over time. And I'll take up very briefly 4 important constitutional judgment to elaborate or to illustrate this case. So in the case of Jammu and Kashmir, for example, you have the Sampat Prakash and the Union of India case, where there was this contention whether the constitutional order which was passed in 1965 pertaining to neutralizing the procedural protections available under preventive detention should be available to citizens in Jammu and Kashmir. The court ruled, however, for example, that it should not avail the procedural protection. However, Sampat Prakash, an employee, a teacher employee, argued otherwise, considering that the very fact that this constitutional order was extended, and not just one time, but many times, in effect, is unconstitutional because the Jammu and Kashmir, constitutional order, the original 1950, in effect, implicate for one-time extension, right? So the court disagreed otherwise, arguing that the court can actually, not the court, for example, the state assembly could actually make radical change to the terms of relationship between the union and the center. Again, in the Makdul Damnu case, you also have this similar case of preventive detention, which in effect was challenged by Makdul Damu on the precise ground that the replacement of Sardar Riyasat as the elective head of Jammu and Kashmir with governor in 1965, in effect, is unconstitutional, right? The Supreme Court, however, struck down, saying that the governor is the legal successor of the Sardar Riyasat, and being the legal successor, the question of obtaining the concurrence of the governor in this case is constitutional as well as legal. And in the notice in there, you'll find 2 important cases which have important implications on how this symmetrical impulse or the integration push could be seen in terms of thin commitment to democracy as well as democratic justice, in terms of the role of the governor, who otherwise is considered to have a special constitutional role in protecting the tribal communities who are, ESCONs within distinctive autonomous councils. And the court, the majority judgment, in fact, in this Edwinton Barre, in fact, this pertains to the constitution of Autonomous District Council for Zowai within the United Khasi and Zaintia Hills, which in effect was a result of the recommendation of a commission of inquiry. And when the report was sent to the governor did not say anything but remark on the report saying that seen thanks. And the question was whether the governor apply his mind in or apply his discretionary power in filtering the possible effect of this legislation or report executive decisions on United Khasi and Zaintia. I'll just stop in 1 minute, right? So the counter argument that Muhammad Hidayatullah made in this is quite quite illuminating, in the sense that he says that the constitutional scheme of things, in effect, requires that the governor plays a proactive role in protecting tribal communities, which cannot be seen as in alignment with our commonsensical understanding of conventional role that governor plays in other parts of India, that is, that the governor should be bound by the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers under Article 163, Clause 1, Subclause 1. And somehow the majority view prevailed, and the result of which is that you have this commitment to democracy under scanner, right? And the last is in the case of Manipur, you have the recent case in 2018, which was decided with the High Court of Manipur, where the case pertained to the disallowance of the chairman of the district council in Manipur to facilitate a no confidence motion on the ground that he should not be entitled to move this no confidence motion within 1 year of his dismissal from office. And the state government come up with this interesting legislation by bringing about amendment in the District Council Act by inserting that these requirements that no chairman who is removed can be allowed to be re-elected within 1 year, and that nominated members of the district council can as well vote. And this was a very strategic as well as diplomatic position taken by the court, not by the court, by the state government, to some sort of neutralize attempts by these representative members to seek a sense of legitimacy as well as popular support. Somehow this commitment to democracy and democratic justice in this sense got implicated in the symmetrical turn in India's asymmetric federalism. I hope I lay out some bare ideas so that I can possibly get some feedback in the course of Q&A. Thank you so much.